Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Fawaz Gerges, who holds the Christian A. Johnson Chair in Middle Eastern Studies at Sarah Lawrence College. He's the author of The Far Enemy, Why Jihad Went Global, and most recently, Journey of the Jihadist Inside Muslim Militancy. Fawaz, welcome to Berkeley.
My pleasure.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Lebanon. I left Lebanon at the end of the 1970s, in particular as a result of the devastating civil war in the country that started in 1975 and ended in 1990.
Before we talk about the impact of that war on you and your family, tell me, looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, Harry, when the civil war started in Lebanon in 1975, I was 16 years old. It was a very devastating experience. It was a shattering experience. You wake up one day at 2 in the morning and you see your neighbors, friends looting your house. You see your nearby neighbors killing, burning, and looting the town. You become a refugee overnight. Your world collapses. I was a typical Lebanese. I come from a middle-class family. I lost dozens of my friends, best friends, schoolmates, relatives, a brother. So in this particular sense, it was a devastating experience. Lebanon, just to give you an example, what I'm talking about is a very tiny country. It had about 3 million people in the mid-1970s. More than 100,000 people were killed, 200,000 people injured, 1 million people displaced. So in this particular sense, it was a devastating social, political, and human experience for all of us.
And before the time of the Civil War, Lebanon had been a successful, multi-ethnic, multi-religious setting.
I basically, Harry, I basically say that Lebanon was the center of the Arab world. The center of the Arab world, and in 1975, the center fell. And in this particular sense, the Arab system lost its balance because of the fall of the center, which was Lebanon in the mid-1970s. At the risk of the cliché, Lebanon was a bridge between the East and the West. Lebanon was a laboratory of religious and cultural coexistence. And in 1975, between 1975 and 1990, Lebanon became a battlefield for inter-Arab rivalries, for intra-Arab rivalries, for religious wars, for Arab-Israeli rivalries, for global and East-West tensions and war by proxies. So in this particular sense, the collapse of the Lebanese experience in 1975 was really pivotal to understanding what happened in the Arab world and the region subsequently.
And importantly, in your book on the journey of the jihadist, you point that the situation deteriorated so much that not only was there conflict between religions, but also there was conflict and factionalism and violence within religions.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very easy to say that what was happening in Lebanon between 1975 and 1990 was basically a religious war between Christians and Muslims. In fact, intra-sectarian tensions were as brutal as the tensions between the Christians and the Muslims. Some terrible fightings took place within the Christian community, within the Muslim communities. In fact, more damage occurred as a result of the intra-communal and sectarian tensions in Lebanon. And as you know, Harry, things are not what they seem to be. Now we talk about Muslim extremism. Now we talk about Muslim jihadis. Many people don't realize that we, and I am a Christian myself, that we had our own warriors of gods in Lebanon, that our warriors of gods killed in the name of Christianity. They pioneered the arts, really, of what I call religious fundamentalism. And in many ways, what happened in Lebanon between 1975 and 1990 was not just a religious war between Christians and Muslims, it was also what I call intra-communal conflicts and also regional and global conflicts as well.
Mm-hmm. So what did you learn from this experience, and how did that impact the studies that you pursued when you left Lebanon?
Well, I mean, I was a teenager, and as I mentioned, Harry, it was a very shattering experience for me, I mean, on every single level. And I think really when I left Lebanon in the 1970s, I wanted to understand the modern history of Islam and the Arab world. I wanted to understand what I call the persistence of social and political violence in that part of the world. I wanted to understand the deepening sectarian and communal conflicts in the region. And in particular, I wanted to understand the dismal failure of what I call the post-colonial Arab state. Why has the post-colonial Arab state failed dismally? Not only to deliver the goods, not only to create institutions, but to create a social contract whereby the idea of citizenship replaces the idea of the sect and the tribe. And I also wanted to understand the role of the great powers and why the great powers, particularly the United States and America, sustains and maintains the dominant authoritarian order in that part of the world.
The two books that I showed at the beginning of the program really focus on the jihadists and how they differ from the Islamicists. What led you down that path? Was it events in the world, or is this still being driven by your experience in Lebanon?
Well, I am a student of Arab and Muslim politics. I study social movements. And my first book, my thesis at Oxford University, where I went to school, was really on the rise of what we call radical Arab nationalism or revolutionary Arab nationalism. And many people don't understand that Islamism and jihadism are social movements. In fact, jihadism was born at the top university departments in the Arab and Muslim world. It was not really born in the ghettos of the Arab world. So in this particular sense, my research endeavors into Islamism and jihadism is really an extension of my interest in understanding social movements, how they rise up, how they evolve and mutate. And this is really what interests me. And that's why what led me to understand and try to study Islamism and jihadism.
Mm-hmm. And if we try to come to understand these movements and the way the formula you use in the Journey book is to look at the different generations of the jihadists and then the splits that occurred within that movement, which we will do in a few minutes. But initially, I would like for you to talk about who are the intellectual forefathers of radicalism in Islam?
I think in the modern world, in the 20th century, I would say that Sayyid Qutb was an Egyptian social critic and an Egyptian Islamist who basically supplied the Islamist and the jihadist movement with its manifestos. Sayyid Qutb was and is the philosopher of the Islamist and the jihadist movement. He really supplied the inspiration and the motivation and basically the attack on what he called the secular, decadent Arab states, which in his eyes were not authentic. So in the 20th century, Sayyid Qutb is the most pivotal voice for the radical Islamist and the jihadist movement.
And he has an interesting story because he went to the United States in the late 40s and was a student even in the Midwest.
Absolutely. Sayyid Qutb was sent by the Ministry of Education in Egypt to the United States between 1948 and 1950s. He spent 2 years in the United States studying in the Midwest. And his experience in the United States really shaped his worldviews of American materialism and capitalism. He looked at the United States as being obsessive materialism. And in fact, he wrote a book, The America That I Have Seen. And the America that I have seen is really a brutal and vehement attack on American materialism and obsessiveness with materialism and sensuality and sexuality. And that particular experience was pivotal in his shaping his subsequent views on the relationship between the Muslim world and the West, particularly the United States.
Mm-hmm. In your work, you try to explore how the different generations of jihadists took these words and built programs on them and were affected by events that the different generations experienced. And you actually, in your recent book, go and interview these jihadists. Talk a little about that, because it's a powerful presentation of what is in the minds of the jihadists by allowing them to talk about their lives and how they experienced events. The first generation is represented by Kamal El-Sad Habib. Tell us about him and how hard it was to get to him, and some of the research and methodology issues in getting his story.
Harry, I was a bit fortunate that I began work on Islamism and jihadism in the late 1980s and early 1990s, long before jihadism became a household name in America. Mm-hmm. Some of us were doing field research in the region. And of course, it was much easier then to really interview militant Islamists than it is today in the post-9/11. Even though I interviewed Kamal Habib. Kamal Habib was one of the top leaders of a jihadist group called Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Harry, now is led by Ayman Zawahiri. He is Al-Qaeda second in command. Egyptian Islamic Jihad was one of the most powerful jihadist organizations in the Arab world. And Kamal Habib played a pivotal role in the plotting and the assassination of the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat. And I went to Egypt in the late 1990s. I wanted to understand the story of the first generation. And what I call the first generation, those pioneers, jihadis, who basically decided to really unleash a war against the modern state system in the region, what they called the near enemy. The near enemy were Arab and Muslim governments. And Kamal was a very important person for me. I wanted to understand his journey. Kamal graduated top in his class at Cairo University in economics and political science. He came from a middle class and upper middle class family. He was destined to be a leader of Egyptian intellectuals and civil society leaders. I wanted to understand why Kamal gambled everything, gave up everything, and decided to take arms and basically rise up against the Egyptian state and Anwar Sadat. I wanted to understand his story. It took me quite a few months to really interview Kamal Habib, because Kamal was sentenced to life in prison, and he spent about 11 years in prison. But finally, after a few months, a few colleagues of mine in Egypt introduced me to Kamal Habib, and they reassured him that I was not, I did not have any intelligence credentials. Mm-hmm. I am an academic, and I spent about a few months with Kamal Habib, really having him tell me his story and the story of his generation. It's a fascinating story. And the book, A Journey of the Jihadist, really, this is not a book about argument. It's what I call a book about voices. I wanted radical jihadis to tell their story in their own words. I wanted the American audience to listen to their own voices, not to rationalize, not to justify, not to really pass any moral judgment, but rather I wanted the American reader to understand the journey of the jihadist, and in particular the three generations. The first generation, that is Kamal Habib generation. The second generation, which is Al-Qaeda generation, or the Afghan Arab generation. And the third generation, what I call the Iraq generation.
Mm-hmm. In looking at this first generation, it seems that the turn to faith as an absolute was a byproduct of two factors that I saw you identified. One was the turning point of the '67 war, which was a shock. And then secondly, the failure of the regimes in the Arab world, and in his case especially Egypt, to create a public space where change could occur.
You know, ironically, most of the first generation, what I call the pioneers, the founding fathers of the jihadist movement, began their careers as nationalists. In fact, Kamal Habib, one of the foremost jihadists himself, he said he and his father cried when Gamal Abdel Nasser, the foremost Arab nationalist, basically died in 1970. And I think the turn to militancy, to Islamist militancy in particular, was as a direct result of the shattering defeat of the Arab states in 1967. Many Arabs came to realize that the secular dominant authoritarian order could not even protect the homeland. Not only did the post-colonial state, the secular authoritarian Arab state, fail to deliver the goods, fail to create effective economic and social institutions, it failed to protect the homeland. It failed to create authentic governments based on a Sharia, the Islamic State. And you're absolutely correct. It was this failure to create legitimate political experiences and to defend the homeland. The defeat, I mean, all the Arab states were defeated by a young, dynamic Jewish state in 1967. That was a shattering experience to the imagination, the Arab imagination, and really the rise of jihadism was a direct product of those two particular factors.
And amidst these failures, the mosque became the center, the only place where one could seek out political activity, even as the religious leaders were essentially co-opted by the state.
Harry, one of the widespread perceptions in the West after 9/11 is that somehow Islam is responsible about what's happening in that part of the world and the tragedy of 9/11. People don't realize that jihadism was not just a revolt against the local, the social and political establishment, but also a revolt against the religious establishment itself. In fact, what jihadists tried to do since the 1960s were to say to their population, listen, not only did Arab and Muslim leaders fail you to provide the goods, they failed to protect the homeland, but the religious establishment itself was co-opted by the secular authoritarian decadent order. So in this particular sense, the jihadism itself was a revolt against the social and political order and also against the religious establishment itself, because they had a vision to replace the failing order with authentic governments based on the Sharia or Islamic law.
And this group, this first generation, really turned to violence in places like Algeria and Egypt, but the adversary was the near adversary. But somehow they were defeated by the states and their secret polices. And what was their response to that?
I mean, Harry, after 9/11, in particular in the United States, the question that was not really explained was, why did jihad go global at the end of the 1990s? Since its inception in the 1960s, the jihadist movement was really locally oriented as opposed to being globally oriented. That is, from the mid-1950s until the mid-1990s, the main target of jihadis were basically, or was, the near enemy. The near enemy meaning Arab and Muslim governments, as opposed to the far enemy being the United States and its allies. When I went to interview jihadis in 1980s and 1990s, Harry, I could not find a single document, a single manifesto by jihadis on the far enemy. Everything was written on the near enemy. That is the main target, the primary target of jihadism between the mid-1950s and the mid-1990s was the near enemy. And what I wanted to understand myself when I wrote the book, The Far Enemy, Why Jihad Went Global, why did jihadism at this belated stage in the mid-1990s decided to go global, decided to target the United States of America? And I asked the question not only because I want to rationalize and justify what happened on 9/11, but rather to understand the shifts and the mutation within the jihadist movement. And as you said, between 1980 and 1990s, local jihadis who targeted the near enemy were strategically defeated by secular Muslim governments in Egypt and Algeria. As you know, there was a major bloody insurgencies in Egypt and Algeria between 1990 and 1996. And when jihadis were defeated by the near enemy, by Arab and Muslim governments, the question on the table was, where do we go from here? How do we rescue the sinking jihadist ship? How do we basically absorb the defeat and basically find a way out of the bottleneck, as Ayman Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda number 2, asked in the late 1990s?
Before we go down that road, which I want to do in a second, I want to emphasize that this body of experience leads to divisions. And because there are two fascinating questions here. One is, what leads the jihadists to moderation? And then what leads them to extremism? Before we talk about extremism, what you're suggesting in your book, as we listen to the words and listen to your analysis, is that important factions of the jihadists essentially were ready to turn to moderation in light of the fact that what had happened to them in prison, where they not only were tortured, but in fact began thinking about the inadequacies of their own politics.
By mid-1990s, local jihadis like Kamal Habib is part of the first generation, or the leader of the first generation, were defeated. And they asked the question, where do we go from here? The overwhelming number of local jihadis decided to basically call it quit. They decided to take a break. They decided to call for a unilateral ceasefire against the near enemy, Arab and Muslim governments. But a tiny faction within the jihadist movement, led by Ayman Zawahiri and other jihadis like Osama bin Laden, they basically, and those are part of when I went to Egypt and Yemen and other places, and I began interviewing jihadis in the 1990s, a great debate raged in the 1990s, where do we go from here? And this tiny faction within the jihadist movement, led by Ayman Zawahiri, made the argument that the only way to rescue the sinking jihadist ship was to shift the focus from the near enemy, Arab and Muslim governments, to the far enemy, the United States and its allies. And Ayman Zawahiri, in memos written to his lieutenants in Yemen and Egypt and London and other places, argued the only way for us to survive is to basically attack the head of the snake being the United States, because he argued, and this is in the late 1990s, Harry, he said, when we attack the far enemy, the head of the snake will likely lash out angrily against the Ummah being the Muslim community worldwide. And when the far enemy lashes out against the Ummah, we would rise up and basically take arms against the far enemy. We would gain, he said, quote unquote, we would gain credibility in the eyes of the Ummah. We failed against the near enemy because we could not convince Arab and Muslim population. We had a vision. In fact, one of the reasons why the jihadist movement, Harry, lost against the near enemy, it could not create a viable social base. It could not convince Arab and Muslim population they had a vision, a viable vision. And Ayman Zawahiri and others argued that the only way to do so, to create a viable coalition, was to attack the far enemy and basically polarize the world into two camps. The camp of belief, led by Al-Qaeda and the new, what I call the transnationalist jihadis, and the world, or the camp of unbelief, led by the far enemy, the United States and its allies.
In your narrative, again and again, you've already discussed Lebanon, and you go on to discuss other external events. I mean, they're internal to the region, but they involve external actors. We can't go into all of these, but I made a list here because here in the United States, there is a failure of history, of remembering the sequence of events and so on. And so we have to understand that as we move to the next generation, these individuals, both the soldiers and the theorists, are affected by events such as the establishment of the State of Israel, the 1967 war, the Lebanese Civil War, the rise of Khomeini, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. funding of the Mujahideen in order to counter the Soviet invasion, the Iran-Iraq War, the invasion of Kuwait and the employment of American troops on Saudi soil, and then the Iraq War I and the Iraq War II. So all of these, in a way, these subsequent generations are experiencing these events, drawing conclusions from them, and becoming radicalized to a new level with new tools. But in the case of al-Qaeda, it's very important to understand that al-Qaeda emerged out of groups that we were supporting in order to counter the Soviet invasion.
I mean, history really is critical to the story. I mean, if we label transnationalist jihadis as evildoers, as the administration has done, the end of discussion and debate. I mean, if they are evildoers, there's no reason to understand history, politics, sociology, and the various factors that have shaped their views. No one is suggesting that they are not murderers. Any attacks on civilians anywhere in the world is terrorism, period, the end of the story. But we need to understand the story. We need to understand why in the late 1990s, a group of religious activists, who we call transnationalist jihadis, decided to target the United States. And as you said, I think the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was truly critical, Harry, to understanding the story of the second generation. I would say that the 1967 war between Israel and its Arab states was pivotal for the creation for the first generation. Mm-hmm. But in the case of what I call the al-Qaeda generation or the Afghan Arab generation, the Afghan war was critical. Why was it critical? Here you have, because it inspired tens of thousands of young Muslims throughout the world, including many Americans, to migrate to Afghanistan and fight on the behalf of the persecuted Afghani community. In the mountains and valleys and battlefields in Afghanistan, an army of mujahideen, Islamic fighters, was born. They felt emboldened. They felt empowered. If they can take on the greatest military machine of the Soviet Union, surely they can take on another great superpower like the United States. And the reason why, Harry, as you said, the Afghan war is very critical, because we were on the side of those Islamic mujahideen who were battling the Soviet Union. We, the United States of America and Saudi Arabia, provided almost $10 billion in support for the Afghan war, for the Afghan mujahideen and the Islamic fighters against the Soviet Union. Remember, the Soviet Union was the evil empire, and the mujahideen were the freedom fighters. And in the eyes of many of those mujahideen, they could not understand why did the United States turn against them at the end of the Afghan war. Many of those mujahideen could not understand why did the United States decide to station permanent troops in Saudi Arabia after the second Gulf War in 1990-1991. And in my interviews and the book I asked, The Far Enemy, Why Jihad Went Global, in fact, one of the most pivotal factors in the story of Osama bin Laden and his mujahideen and his jihadis was basically the permanent stationing of American troops in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is critical to the story of the second generation.
And it is important in understanding the Afghan war that these regimes that we've been talking about were very supportive of the resistance to Russian invasion. So they were schooling their young people to take up a gun and go fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets.
In many ways, Harry, I think it is accurate to say that the Afghan war between 1979 and 1989 was really similar to the Spanish Civil War. It was really, it represented an awakening on the part of the Muslim community worldwide. And the United States and its allies, particularly Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, including Egypt, played a major role in the migration of tens of thousands of young Muslims to the mountains and valleys and battlefields of Afghanistan. In fact, Saudi Arabia used to provide 75% discount on every airline ticket to a mujahid, an Islamic fighter who would go to Afghanistan. The United States provided billions of dollars to the Pakistani security forces and military forces to arm the mujahideen in Afghanistan. And this is why the Afghan war, in every single level, was really the driver behind the rise of a new generation, what I call the second generation, the Afghan Arabs. But the story of Osama bin Laden himself could not be understood without understanding the second Gulf War, what I call the catalyst. When the United States decided to maintain troops, permanent troops in Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden left Saudi Arabia in 1991 and decided to declare war on the United States. Harry, a footnote, historical footnote. Up to 1991, Osama bin Laden was in the same trenches as the United States, the Pakistani government, and Saudi Arabia against the evil empire. It was in 1991 that Osama bin Laden left Saudi Arabia and went to Pakistan and then to Sudan and then back to Afghanistan. And this is why we have to understand what happened in 1991. In fact, up to 1995, Osama bin Laden was on record saying he was against targeting American civilians, up to 1995. And this is why, even though we know that he is a murderer, even though we know that he ordered murderers to target American civilians and Muslim civilians, we need to understand his journey. Why did Osama bin Laden did have a major breakup with the United States and Saudi Arabia and decided to declare an all-out war against the United States and its allies?
And this then makes one go back to what you said earlier, that in the intellectual origins of the jihadists, there is an emphasis on the spiritual, on the absolute devotion to the faith, so that the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, the home of the two holy sites, is in essence a desecration in the eyes of some jihadists.
Well, I think it's very difficult for us in the United States because we are relatively a secular nation. We cannot really understand the role and the place of faith in people's lives in that part of the world. Saudi Arabia was the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, where Prophet Muhammad was born and lived all his life. Saudi Arabia is the place of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest Muslim shrines. Saudi Arabia resonates deeply in the Muslim imagination. And the stationing of American troops in Saudi Arabia, in the eyes of Osama bin Laden and his entourage, represented a great crime, humiliation against Islam and against Islamic culture. And I think, to me, I come back, Harry, because you reminded me, your question was very critical, understanding the question of faith and how religion basically is the driver when we talk about religious activists like Islamists and jihadists. Even myself, I find it extremely difficult when I interview Islamists and radical jihadists to understand this pivotal place, this pivotal role of religion in their life. They behave in the modern world as if God really is giving them orders. They behave in the modern world as somehow faith is the most critical component of their well-being. And this is really what's really essential for us in the United States to understand, in particular for students, is that for certain societies, for certain communities, faith is the most decisive factor in their well-being. And this is really what we need to understand.
Mm-hmm. There's one other element that I want to bring up that you touch on in your work. You were looking at the biography of a soldier, Abu Jandal, who is part of the second generation, and that is the way these soldiers of faith, or whatever we will call them, were products of globalization, in a sense, so that having gone through this Afghan experience and then nothing to do, in essence, the enemy was defeated, namely the Soviet Union, that they were seized opportunities to engage in struggle in other parts of the world, Bosnia, Chechnya, and so on. And again, this goes back to the comparison you made with the Spanish Civil War. Talk about that, because it's very important. It is a set of experiences and a set of opportunities that the increasingly globalized world present.
I don't think we can understand the globalization of jihad without understanding the Afghan war itself. The Afghan war contributed to the globalization of jihad, the creation of an army of mujahideen, Islamic fighters who are ready to battle on the behalf of the Ummah, the Islamic community worldwide. Not only did the Afghan war between 1979 and 1989 globalize jihad, but also, Harry, and this is part of history, what we need to understand, there were so many fault lines, so many war zones in the 1980s and 1990s, Bosnia, Kosovo, Chechnya, Albania, and other places where there was really an awakening on the part of the Muslim community. And the Afghan war played a major role in this particular equation, really contributing to the rise of the awakening of what I call Islamic awakening and revival. So yes, but also what we need to understand also that how the Islamic revolution in Iran itself in 1975 also, and the systemic effort on the part of the mullahs in Iran to export their vision and revolution to the rest of the Arab world. Many jihadis whom I interviewed, even though they're Sunni jihadis, as opposed to being Shiites like Iran, they were terribly influenced by the Islamic revolution in Iran. The Islamic revolution in Iran provided a model to be imitated throughout that part of the world.
And what one is left with a really powerful sense from your works and what you're saying here that we can't understand what has become our adversary unless we understand their history and the narratives that compel them. And sometimes that history is a product of the unintended consequences of our actions.
I mean, whoever believed that the Afghan war would not only bring about the defeat of the Soviet Union and probably the collapse of the former Soviet Union, but also former jihadis who were relatively supported by the United States and its allies would turn their guns against the United States of America. The same mujahideen whom we supported, and if not directly, the Pakistani government and Saudi Arabia and other governments basically decided to take on the United States and turn their guns against the United States. Not only we need to understand the context, but also we need to understand our own actions, Harry. We, the United States of America, we are not an innocent bystander in this particular tragic play. We are an active player in this particular tragic play. Not only we supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, not only we supplied arms and money and intelligence, we also decided to intervene in the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991, and also maintain tens of thousands of American troops in Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, and thus antagonize a large critical segment of the Muslim world. American foreign policy is a critical factor in this particular equation. This is not to say that what happened on 9/11 or subsequently can ever justify or rationalize the actions of those murderers, but the United States has been a critical player. Our actions do make a difference, and we need to understand not only the context, but also American foreign policy as well.
And this definitely applies to what we can call the third generation, the new resistance that is emerging, in response to the American invasion of Iraq, which has become the al-Muqawama, is that how you pronounce it?
Al-Muqawama, the resistance.
It's a resistance, which is now a very powerful force in the Muslim world.
We talked about the first generation, that is the pioneers or the founding fathers, and we talked about the second generation, Al-Qaeda generation or the Afghan Arabs and how the Afghan war was really critical. Now, I and other academics are talking about the third generation, the Iraq generation, broadly defined. And Harry, I have been, in the last 15 months, I have been residing in the Middle East as a Carnegie Scholar. I have interviewed hundreds of activists, of young kids, teenagers, who are desperately trying to go to Iraq and fight the Americans. And in fact, you cannot understand the rise of the third generation, the Iraq generation, without understanding critical foreign policy decisions made by the United States. It's the decision to invade and occupy Iraq a few years ago. Our invasion and occupation of Iraq has basically now contributed to the rise of the third generation, the Iraq generation. And what's ironic and what's tragic as well, the third generation, the Iraq generation of militants, seems to be bloodier and more militant than the second generation, that is the Al-Qaeda generation. Whoever believed that you can really have a new generation which is really more militant and bloodier than the Al-Qaeda generation. Terrorism for the third generation is now the rule rather than the exception. The Al-Qaeda leadership, Harry, used and has used terrorism as a political tool to basically send messages and achieve strategic purposes. Now the third generation is using terrorism as a rule. It's no longer an exception, not only against the coalition forces and the United States forces, but also against Muslims, particularly Shiite Iraqis.
Somewhere in one of your books, you suggest that the ideology driving U.S. foreign policy, an ideology of triumphalism, of intervention and transformation, that in a sense fuels the fire of those, on this third generation. Talk a little about that.
Ironically, in the late 1990s, when Ayman Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda number 2, was trying to convince his lieutenants to join the jihad, the global jihad against the United States, he made it very clear that when we attack the far enemy would lash out angrily against the Ummah, and we would gain credibility in the eyes of the Ummah. To many of the young Muslim teenagers who are desperately trying to join the fight in Iraq, they have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. Nothing to do with Al-Qaeda whatsoever. I ask him, Harry, when I interview young teenagers in Egypt and Yemen and Syria and other places, why are you trying to go to Iraq and basically get killed in the process? And those teenagers, 15, 16, 17 years old, look me in the eyes and tell me, are you being patronizing? You don't understand why we are trying to go to Iraq and fight on the behalf of the Ummah? Our land is being occupied by an infidel power. The United States of America is waging a crusade against Islam and Muslims. In many ways, our narrative, the U.S. narrative, Harry, in the last few years, we are in Iraq in order to liberalize and democratize. We are in Iraq in order to help Iraqis create a new political experience. I would like you to know, Harry, that very few Muslims I have talked to believe in this particular narrative. In fact, what appears to have happened in the last few years is that the Al-Qaeda ideological claims, that is, the United States is waging a crusade against Islam and Muslims, appears to find receptive ears among many Muslims, not just radical Islamists, but even mainstream Muslims. And tragically, the American-led invasion and occupation of Iraq has radicalized and militarized a critical component of mainstream public opinion, as opposed to radical and militant Islamist opinion.
When you look on the American debate on U.S. foreign policy, and I'm thinking of Thomas Friedman, who invariably will have a column that says, where are the moderates in the Muslim world? Why do not they come forward? What is your response to that?
Two questions, Harry, after 9/11 dominated the two simplistic questions. Two reductionist questions dominated the debate in the United States. Where are the Muslim moderates and why do they hate us so much? Think about the two debates. Every time I go on American television, why do they hate us so much? The idea is that somehow not only they equate jihadis with Islamists, they equate jihadis with the entire Muslim community. The entire Muslim community, in the eyes of those reductionist American commentators, basically hate the United States. Nonsense. It's nonsense because there's a great deal of fascination towards America. There's a great deal of attraction towards America. Even those who are deeply critical of American foreign policy have great respect for the American idea, the American dream, the open society, the respect for human rights. So no, they don't hate America. In fact, they are very critical of American foreign policy. Where are the Muslim moderates, Harry? That's the question. And the reason why this question is very critical, because this question led to what I call a conceptual flaw in American foreign policy, a flaw to equate this tiny, group of jihadis, who number, by the way, in a few thousand. We're talking about 3,000-4,000 transnational jihadis with the entire Muslim community and lead us to the killing fields of Iraq. In fact, in my book, The Far Enemy, I document the universal rejection of Al-Qaeda and 9/11 by the entire Muslim community and the clerical community. Not only did clerics and mainstream clerics in the Muslim world denounce Al-Qaeda and 9/11, including some of the top clerics, Hassan Fadlallah of Lebanon, the top Shiite cleric, Hassan al-Turabi, the Turabi of Sudan, Yusuf Qardawi of Egypt, but even former jihadis, Harry, local jihadis, vehemently criticized Al-Qaeda and 9/11 because to them 9/11 threatened the very existence of the Islamist movement. Dozens of books written by former jihadis, hundreds of articles, great debate raging in the Muslim world about 9/11 and critiques of 9/11 and Al-Qaeda. Yet in the United States, our commentators, who neither read Arabic nor pay attention to the raging debate in the Muslim world, keep asking, where are the Muslim moderates? All they had to do was to basically read the press on a daily basis. All they had to do was to go and to interview radical former jihadis to realize there was a universal rejection of Al-Qaeda and 9/11 and the murders that were perpetrated against the United States. One of the reasons why there was some misunderstanding, I believe, because while most clerics and most civil society leaders denounced Al-Qaeda and 9/11, they do think that its rhetoric makes sense, the critique of American foreign policy. And this particular confusion between criticizing American foreign policy and denouncing the murderous tactics of Al-Qaeda and 9/11 explains, I think, the confusion that basically has dominated the American scene after 9/11.
Some of the critiques that you cite in your Far Enemy book are quite insightful. I mean, what are the goals here, they're asking Al-Qaeda? What are the resources? What will be the consequences? So it's a very pragmatic view of what they perceive as a political failure.
You know, when I went to Egypt and Yemen and other places, Muslim countries, after 9/11, the question, even some of the leading, even Kamal Habib and his associates, they said, listen, we could not take on the near enemy. In the 1980s and 1990s, we were defeated by the near enemy. How could we take on the far enemy, the greatest military, economic, and political power in the world? And why would we unleash the power of the United States, not only against the Islamist movement, but even against the Ummah itself? It was a very pragmatic, very utilitarian critique, but also there was a moral component. Some of the clerics, some of the leading Muslim clerics, like Tantawi and Yusuf Qardawi, did focus on the question that the attacks on American civilians violate the deep values of Islam, that Islam does not sanction targeting civilians, does not really sanction aggression against states that were not in war with the Muslim Ummah.
How would you like your insights to affect U.S. foreign policy, and how do you see that process? Because I mean, you're laying out quite an interesting analysis of the error of our ways in perceiving the Muslim world. How do you think your analysis can be made to make a difference?
Harry, I come back to the question of the conceptual flaw in the dominant narrative within the administration and the U.S. commentary community. And again, we really cannot understand why we find ourselves where we are today in the shifting sands in Iraq, why we have alienated the mainstream Muslim community without understanding this conceptual flaw. What am I talking about? I'm talking about after 9/11, we have created what I call the Al-Qaeda-centric approach. The Al-Qaeda-centric approach is an approach that lumps all jihadis together, the local jihadis and the transnational jihadis. The Al-Qaeda-centric approach lumps all Islamists together with Al-Qaeda. In the sense, as the president said, they are part of Islamofascism. They're all Islamofascist. And this is a great misreading of the complexity of the Muslim seed, that there are what I have been trying to say, there are major differences, not only within the jihadist movement, but also between Islamists and jihadists. And if we understand this particular, what I call the fault lines that exist between jihadis and also between jihadis and Islamists, we can understand that this particular war cannot be won on the battlefield. That the most effective means, Harry, to win this particular war against Al-Qaeda is to internally encircle Al-Qaeda. The most effective means to win this particular war against transnational jihadis is to create alliances with mainstream Muslim public opinions and also moderate Islamists. Because, in fact, I would argue that after 2002, Al-Qaeda was in a coma. Al-Qaeda was in a coma because Al-Qaeda was internally encircled. Al-Qaeda could not have universal support in the Muslim world. What we did, of course, after 2002, by expanding the war on terror, by invading Iraq, by trying to forcefully engineer social and political change, we have played into the hands of Al-Qaeda. We have given Al-Qaeda more ideological ammunition, motivation. We have revived Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda now, as all our intelligence services say, is a much more powerful agency than it used to be in 2002.
When we look at the Arab Muslim world, one sees, and it comes out in your description of the Lebanon Civil War and the various ways things have played out, we see there's so many fault lines between sects, between tribes, between clans, between religious communities, and on and on. How do you see this process of changing the course of our policy that you just described by responding to the moderates in the region? How do you see the transcendence of all of these fault lines and divisions?
I mean, tragically, after 9/11, we portrayed the conflict as a conflict between the United States of America and certain components of Muslim societies. Call them Islamists, call them radical Islamists or mainstream Islamists or jihadists. I think what people don't really, the reason why, I mean, your question is very critical, because the internal fault lines within the Muslim world are as important as the fault lines between jihadis and the Western states, particularly the United States of America. And those fault lines, Harry, are really shaking Arab and Muslim societies to their very foundations. I'm talking about sectarian fault lines. I'm talking about socioeconomic fault lines. You have between 30 and 40% of Arab and Muslim populations live either in poverty or below the poverty line. You have oppressive governments that have bled their societies dry. You have hardly any democracies. I mean, failed economies and failed institutions. And also, there is a widespread perception in the region that we, the United States of America, is maintaining the status quo in the region, maintaining this oppressive order, this oppressive political order, and also the failed post-colonial state in the region. And I think a first step in this particular equation is to what I call, I called it conceptual flaw, is to have what I call a real understanding of the dynamics, of the patterns, of the fault lines, that internal fault lines in the regions are real. And we need to find ways and means, what I call a grand strategy, to rejuvenate failed economies, failed institutions, to build alliances with Arab and Muslim societies, civil societies, as opposed to going to bed with oppressive dictators.
One final question. If students were watching this program, how would you advise them to prepare for achieving understanding of the region, but also if they want to become scholars of the region? What are the prerequisites for doing that?
I tell my students, Harry, is that there is nothing unique. There is nothing unique about the Arab and Muslim world. What's happening in the Arab and Muslim world is part of what I call a historical process of development, political transition, and evolution. And the first thing they must do is to read greatly in history, in politics, in sociology, in anthropology, in order to understand the dynamics in the region, in order to understand the internal dynamics that have shaped Arab and Muslim politics, and in particular, since the last 300 years, and also the pivotal role that the great powers have done, in particular the Western powers and the United States, and the role of colonialism in shaping the destinies of the region.
Fawaz, on that note, I want to thank you for your two books, which I will show our audience again, both of which I recommend highly, The Far Enemy and Journey of the Jihadists. Thank you very much for appearing on our program today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.